Is Donald Trump the most conservative president in US history? Well, I just made a video talking about whether or not Biden is the most progressive in US history, so I guess we gotta talk about Trump now, from the opposite end. And of course, I'm just talking about his first term because as of this video, his second term hasn't happened yet. It won't be starting for over a month. So let's talk about conservative presidents. And in the running, we mostly have modern Republicans, really, because that's when the word conservative mostly came about, at least as it relates to political parties. So we've got guys like Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, and George W. Bush. So Trump, of course, we're not going to talk that much about him as a person because we all know that he as a person is not really that conservative. How can you call Donald Trump's lifestyle conservative? I mean, just ask Stormy Daniels how conservative Trump's lifestyle is. And he's also been all over the map in terms of the rhetoric he's used over the years. He said stuff like, oh, abortion should be up to the states. My administration will be great for reproductive rights. He said, oh, women should be punished for abortions. He said that on the campaign trail in 2016. So we're mostly just going to focus on what his administration did, what policies happened, and kind of compare it and contrast it with other conservative-ish presidents. So right off the bat, something that's really interesting about him is that he, in a single term, got to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices. That's more than Obama did in 2 terms. That's more than Bush did in 2 terms. That's more than Clinton did in 2 terms. He gets 3. So these 3 Supreme Court justices end up being instrumental in overturning Roe versus Wade. Had Hillary Clinton been elected, Roe versus Wade would not be overturned. So yeah, that's a huge win for conservatives. Almost every conservative or pro-lifer you'll meet is happy about that there's no longer a federal right to abortion under the US Constitution. But if we look at the people Trump appointed to the Supreme Court, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Barrett, they're actually all less conservative than some of the people that George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush appointed to the Supreme Court. Look at Samuel Alito, far more conservative than those 3. Clarence Thomas, even more conservative than Alito, and more conservative, obviously, than Gorsuch, Barrett, and Kavanaugh. So in terms of Supreme Court nominees, Trump has actually been a little more center-right. And all 3 of those justices that I just named have from time to time joined the liberals. I mean, Alito and Thomas have too, but less frequently than those 3. So on the Supreme Court, the result of Trump's presidency was a major conservative victory, no doubt, in terms of policy and constitutional interpretation. But in terms of the ideology of the people he put on the Supreme Court, I would argue he is less conservative than the Bushes, probably less conservative than Reagan even. Reagan, of course, put Scalia on the court and elevated William Rehnquist to Chief Justice. So Trump's economic policy, we have to talk about that too. This is the bread and butter stuff that's really important. Trump cut taxes primarily for the wealthy and gave temporary tax cuts to those in the middle class and those in the lower class. They're set to expire, and yet the tax cuts for the uber wealthy were permanent. This is the type of thing that's frequently happening under Republican administrations. It happened under Bush, at least tax cuts for the uber wealthy. Happened under Reagan. George H.W. Bush, of course, ended up having to raise taxes after saying, read my lips, no new taxes. So on economic policy, I think Trump is pretty similar to most other Republicans. Maybe less generous to the middle class. After all, Reagan actually slashed taxes for the middle class more than Donald Trump did. And I know a lot of conservatives like to act like the Republican Party is for lower taxes across the board, but that's not always the case, at least not in the long term. Also, if we look at Trump's tariffs that he's proposing for his next term, even though he hasn't done that yet, that's something that will probably make him actually less popular among conservatives. But we're just focusing on the first term now. We got to talk about regulations too. Trump was the deregulator in chief. He slashed environmental regulations. He obviously came after 2 terms of Obama, so he felt like he had a lot of work to do there. I mean, just cutting regulations off the cuff. It was a rambunctious time, just paying attention to the numbers he was dealing on the regulatory state. He also withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement, a pretty typical conservative thing on environmental policy and foreign policy that right-wingers tend to support. So yeah, very strong enemy of the administrative state, very critical of environmental regulations, more so, I would say, than George W. Bush, who, of course, talked a pretty good game on climate change at times, but did preside over a lot of environmental deregulation. Way more conservative than George H.W. Bush, and probably more conservative than Ronald Reagan. Reagan, of course, deregulated the EPA strongly, but also signed the agreement that ended up fixing the ozone hole. The ozone hole, if you don't remember, the late 80s, there was a real risk that this thing was going to cause skin cancer. So Reagan ended up signing that. George H.W. Bush, more pro-environmental president. The guys before Trump, I mean, don't even get me started on Richard Nixon, the guy who created the EPA. This guy is more progressive than Trump by miles. Now, there is another area in which I think Trump could be less conservative than the modern and, I guess, 20th century Republican counterparts. That would be crime. Trump, of course, signed the First Step Act at the end of 2018. This is something a lot of progressives gave him credit for. It's something he's even been criticized by conservatives for. I don't know if anyone watching knows Jesse Lee Peterson, but Jesse Lee Peterson is a huge Trump fan, a huge Trump sycophant, if you will, and he said that the First Step Act was one of the only mistakes that Donald Trump made. So he's tough on crime, and he's saying, no, Trump went too soft on crime. It wasn't some revolutionary thing, but it was definitely something that if Richard Nixon were around right now, trying to get the Republican nomination, he would not be happy to see something like that, because Richard Nixon was the original law and order, tough on crime Republican. Reagan, again, pretty similar. Then we have to talk about the border. So how does Trump stack up on immigration compared to other Republican presidents? Well, he stacks up pretty conservatively. I mean, you remember those graphics that popped up, kids in cages, families being separated. And yes, that did happen under Obama, but that doesn't mean that Trump is more progressive than Obama. Obama was conservative on the border, but Trump was likewise quite conservative on the border. I would say more so than George W. Bush, more so than Reagan, who actually granted amnesty and, of course, touted the values of immigration frequently. Go look up that speech he gave about immigration in the 80s, just like talking about how, yeah, you can come to America and live the American dream. Trump would scoff at that. And, you know, he's talking about doing more mass deportations for his next term. But yeah, immigration-wise, I mean, Eisenhower also big deporter, but I think for his time period, Trump stacks up pretty well against him. There was some real momentum, I think, in the form of DACA for helping immigrants, being pro-immigrant, and Trump tried to get rid of that too. So, and you know, Biden, for all his issues on immigration, he's been harsh on the border, but he didn't try to get rid of DACA. So yeah, on immigration, Trump, yet again, is a very solidly conservative guy. Then we can talk about social issues too, because oh boy, there's a lot to say. Trump came into office saying he's okay with same-sex marriage. And of course, if he came in there in 2001 saying that, or 2005, or 1997, all hell would break loose among the Republican Party. But I think by 2015, 2016, a lot of Republicans were ready to move on. They were. They just were. And it might have been something that actually helps Trump in the election. I mean, he's a very talented guy. He knows how to appeal to normies. At least back in 2016 he did. And apparently in 2024 he still does, although his conduct's become more outrageous. But yeah, he changed his mind on the issue. He formerly said he was for traditional marriage. I like traditional marriage, he would say. And now he's like, yeah, I'm okay with it because the Supreme Court said it's okay. So that's one issue where in his rhetoric, he's fairly progressive. Certainly not as conservative as some of those other guys that I mentioned. Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan would all be appalled to hear a Republican president or candidate for president saying something like that. So, yeah, and I talked about abortion already. He's made it so that states can now put down these full abortion bans upon their citizens. States have the discretion to do that. I don't know. I mean, short of signing a national abortion ban, it's hard to imagine how much more conservative you could get on that issue. And we don't know if he's going to sign one. But yeah. So, economics, border, crime, social issues. Foreign policy comes next, and it's a difficult one to classify. So he's not a hardcore neoconservative like George W. Bush. He certainly loved to do drone strikes. He increased them over 400% from Obama, and Obama already did a lot. Trump, of course, did not send ground troops to any new countries, and that's something that he gets credit for a lot on the right. They'll use it to broadly say that Trump is anti-war and the opposite of a neocon as a whole. I disagree with that, but it is true that he's not a guy who has sent troops into countries and launched ground invasions. So I find foreign policy very difficult to categorize. I will say if he goes into office and lets Benjamin Netanyahu do whatever he wants to Gaza and Palestine, that will cement him as being very conservative on foreign policy. If you ask almost any Republican in Congress, they will say they love Israel and basically they think Israel should be allowed to do whatever they want. Fox News would cheer it on. They would love it. So it's looking like he's more conservative on foreign policy. That type of thing is very tough to assess. As I said in one of my previous videos, what really is a progressive foreign policy or a conservative foreign policy? So ultimately, I'm not going to say that he's far more conservative than any other Republican president has been on foreign policy. So ultimately, what do I think? I think Trump is probably the most conservative president in terms of policy that we've ever had. I think that's true, notwithstanding the fact that he said he supports same-sex marriage. That could be seen as a sign of just evolving with the times anyhow, but yeah, generically right-wing on economic policy, very right-wing on regulatory policy, very right-wing on the border. And he had some deviations on the issue of crime, despite his rhetoric of law and order, and some deviations on social issues, with the exception of abortion. But yeah, no, he's a very conservative guy, and I think it was Ben Shapiro one time said he's the most conservative president in history. That's possible. I don't know. But where would I rank him exactly? I think he could be possibly number one, maybe number two or number three, behind just someone like Reagan or someone like Richard Nixon, mostly Nixon for his very tough on crime policies, Reagan for his deregulatory policies, his anti-labor union policies, his tax cuts. And yeah, I mean, probably more conservative than George W. Bush even. George W. Bush was big into tax cuts, big into deregulation, neoconservative on foreign policy, but at the same time also signed Medicare Part D. So this was a guy who wanted to get government generally more involved in healthcare. And then Trump, of course, tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act on the issue of healthcare. That's another part of his economic record where it's like, again, he's a solid right-winger. So yeah, conservatives, if you like conservative policy, Trump actually probably is your guy. He is. If you have other issues with him, then he probably is not your guy because there's a whole lot going on with that man. We know that he's lived a very liberal lifestyle. He's a former Democrat. He's got some extra populism to his rhetoric that a lot of very conservative Republicans don't also have. So yeah, that's my assessment of him. Possibly the most conservative president in history, probably in the top three. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think Trump is the most conservative president? Do you think his conservatism is overrated? I'm eager to know. As always, please like, comment, or subscribe to the channel if you found this video interesting or insightful. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next video.